Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In 4 days, the curtain will fall on 2018. The media have already put out the highlights, or as some prefer to call, lowlights of US President Donald Trump's mercurial foreign policy decisions. What exactly does Trump stand for? Is he following the traditional post-World War II US policy of grand strategy that is grounded in US primacy or hegemony, if you will, US involvement in other regions, US exceptionalism? Or is he moving towards isolationism? Is what Benjamin Rhodes called the blob still actively perpetuating the US grand strategy? Or are we looking at a president who wakes up in the morning, takes to Twitter and fires off whatever fancies him at that moment? To discuss this, we have with us Van Megerdatchian, a French political analyst and journalist based in Paris, Michael Arnold, a Canadian analyst currently working at TRT World's Research Center, Muslim bin Imran, an IR expert based in Kuala Lumpur, Professor Steve Keen, who teaches economics at Kingston University, and Ubaida Hittu, an analyst based in Istanbul. So let me kick off with Professor Keen. Professor Keen, when you look at Donald Trump's foreign policy, do you find affinities with what we have seen previously, what I talked about as the US grand strategy post-World War II, which has had certain determinants, or do you think there's been a departure?
He's been a weird combination as well, because the man clearly has overblown narcissistic tendencies that make him want to have him the greatest American and America the greatest nation on the planet. That's the usual American exceptionalism vision. He certainly shares that. But at the same time, he has this very inconsistent contradiction of the Washington Consensus, contradiction of the Monroe Doctrine, and so on. He's anti the big presence in the Middle East, and even though he's been extremely ham-fisted about that, at one stage pulling out of Syria, at the other stage moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. So there's no predictable strategy, but I think he certainly shifted away from the ever-expanding military of America while still trying to push the military power of America. So I don't want to try to make sense of Donald Trump, but he's definitely a departure from what's gone before.
That's a very important point you make, because what we have seen over the years, many decades, and analysts have talked about it, the Wilsonian streak of the US foreign policy and the Jacksonian streak of the US foreign policy. Now, you mentioned that on the one hand, he's withdrawing troops from Syria. He's also talked about halving the number of troops in Afghanistan and keeps on saying that he doesn't want to be in these wars. And yet, he withdraws from JCPOA with Iran. Then he moves the embassy to Jerusalem. So how does this square up? I mean, if we move away from what I said in the introduction and what you also said about his tendencies, are we saying that there is absolutely no policy, or is there some method to his madness?
I think there's madness to his method. That's closer to the truth. His behaviour, I think, is given away in a discussion he had with a Republican candidate 2 or 3 elections before he won, where he said his negotiating tactic was to, advising, I think, in negotiations over arms reductions with Russia, was to arrive half an hour late at the meeting and then stride right in and slam his hand down on the desk in front of the Russian counterpart and basically swear at him. It's shock tactics, and that's how he seems to start. And then after the shock tactics, he goes back and says, let's all be reasonable about this. We saw that with his behaviour towards Kim Jong-il, who he first of all called Rocket Man, and it was virtually threatening to bomb the place, and then comes out and he's now friends with the dictator of North Korea. So that's the only pattern. It seems to be a negotiating style from the aggressive world of real estate in New York, which of course is where he learned whatever trade he has, he learned there.
So what do you think the American establishment, or what I refer to as the blob, might be thinking? And now, of course, James Mattis has also resigned. Kelly resigned earlier. McMaster is gone. Flynn went very early. The cabinet has seen lots of people, come in and go. And it's just been 22 months. it's something which seems pretty chaotic. So what do you expect 2019 is likely to be in terms of the U.S. approach to the rest of the world?
Well, I think Trump is going to be emboldened by pulling out of Syria and pulling out of Afghanistan. When you look at the 17 years they've been in Afghanistan, the pointless entry into the Syrian conflict, he has a good point on that front. And it may take somebody like him to shock America out of those pointless conflicts it's involved in, which it can never win. But at the same time, the military-industrial complex, as President General Eisenhower termed it back in the 1960s, is predicated on continuing to supply arms for conflicts of that nature. So he will be alienating his military in America while potentially getting kudos from Americans who themselves are justifiably tired of those pointless wars. But I think the American military will now be ganging up against him as best they can, and it won't be easy.
Okay, so you make very important points. Now, if in theory, President Trump were to say, look, fellas, I don't want these wars, and I think I'm going to focus on the domestic politics and what we need to do in the U.S., exactly what he said on Jan 20, 2017, when he took over, he said, America first. Now, then it would make sense for him to have stuck to the JCPOA and tried to have some kind of deal between Israel and Palestine. But as we mentioned before, and as you have also mentioned, on the one hand, he does something completely different or says something completely different, and then he goes on and does something which is likely to destabilize. Now, that is, I find a great discrepancy between these positions that he takes, and these are the positions that make the allies very jittery, and also, his approach to the European Union, with Germany, with the UK, with France. None of this seems to make any sense, any structural sense to lots of onlookers.
I don't think it does make any sense. I think it's foolish to try to interpret it in any logical or strategic way. I think Mattis said on his departure that Trump is somebody who, or Tillerson, I think it was, said that Trump doesn't want to read documents, doesn't want to be briefed. He goes with his gut instincts. And those gut instincts, again, have been shaped by the real estate battles in New York, the many times he's managed to use bankruptcy as a weapon there, strong arm tactics, but at the same time, siding with different communities. So he's very much on the side with the Israeli, pro-Israeli community in New York. And they're doing something symbolic on that sense, which makes sense to that part of what he sees as his base. It's got very little to do with America's international strategic position. So it is really something you have to say, what's the developer from the Bronx with all the ties that implies going to want? It certainly won't be something that's in the overall strategic interests of America.
Okay, so final question, and I know I don't particularly like asking people to project into the future, because especially when it comes to someone like Donald Trump, each morning can bring a different message. But nonetheless, I will still ask this question: what do you expect in 2019, especially in the conflict zones?
In the international sphere, I think he'll probably be emboldened by pulling out of Syria and pulling out of Afghanistan. That'll give him a boost in the polls. It'll give him popularity, because the wars have become not as unpopular as Vietnam got to be, because a smaller number of Americans have been involved. There's no conscription, but it'll certainly boost his popularity. Pulling out won't have the dire consequences that have been predicted in some of those countries. He probably will make things worse in some ways for some groups there, but it's bad enough anyway. So I think he'll probably be emboldened to go on from that and pull out of some other useless American military interventions. But at the same time, he wants to strengthen the nuclear arsenal, which of course provokes problems with Russia. So I think he'll basically, the only thing he can imagine is he's going to try to make stuff which makes him the center of attention, and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, restarting the build-up of American nuclear arms, destabilizing that treaty. We're all going to be talking about Donald Trump, and that's what he enjoys.
Absolutely, you are absolutely right. On the one hand, it's all about the nuclear posture review, getting new missiles for the submarines, and of course, also getting out of the INF treaty. And also the strategy document saying that the new rivals are going to be China and Russia. There's a lot of chaos here. Thank you so much, Professor Keen, for talking to us. And we now have with us Muslim bin Imran, who is an international relations expert based in Kuala Lumpur, but a Palestinian by origin. Thank you so much, Muslim, for being with us. What do you make of President Trump's foreign policy? Is this a continuation of what is generally called the blob inside the Beltway, or is this something completely chaotic?
American foreign policy, I would say, is a continuation of the previous administration's foreign policy in some respects, but Trump has certainly added his flavor. President Trump's latest decision to pull troops out of Syria is a sign of the continuation of Obama's retreat from hot zones around the world. The U.S. hegemony, I would say, is in decline, and that is not new. Obama's policy wanted to concentrate on some spots in the world, the Pacific in particular. Therefore, he started to reduce his administration's engagement in different parts of the world, including the Middle East. Trump is speeding up this American retreat, and it certainly comes from his personal views in the first place, because the American establishment is not exactly excited about President Trump's acceleration of their decline. President Trump comes with an ultra-realist perspective towards politics.
No, but hold on, Muslim, hold on. If Trump comes with an ultra-realist perspective, then he should be very close to what the blob says, or what the blob has been saying in terms of the U.S. grand strategy since post-World War II. But what we have seen, and I was just discussing this with Professor Keen before you joined us, that on the one hand, he says, I want to get out of these wars. Okay, fine. But on the other hand, he gets out of this JCPOA with Iran. He moves the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And the second thing is something that is going to destabilize rather than stabilizing the Middle East. So we see these disparate strands in his approach.
Okay, by ultra-realist, I was referring to his push to eliminate idealism from American foreign policy. Trump, the U.S. foreign policy has usually had two contending paradigms.
One the Wilsonian and the Jacksonian.
One is for propagating U.S. ideals, even through military power. Another is what Trump is doing now. He is looking at national interests from a very narrow perspective. He is alienating his allies, and that actually, again, shows that he is an ultra-realist. He does not care much about what his allies think as long as he gets cash. His economic policy is a mercantilist policy, and the trade war with China is a proof of that. He wants to create jobs in the U.S. at the cost of his alliances internationally, and this has certainly alienated many of his of the U.S. traditional allies. You look at his policy in the Korean Peninsula. Look at his policy towards some of his allies in the Middle East. Trump is certainly unique in his blind support for the Israeli occupation. Other American administrations have always supported Israeli occupation, but Trump is giving more I would say, frankness to what the American administrations have always wanted to do when it comes to the case of Israel. But in general, what Trump is doing is a continuation of President Obama's retreat from the Middle East.
Are you saying that
it is only getting faster?
Okay, so are you saying that you find continuity in Trump's policy in relation to what happened before? Simply that Trump is a little more brazen? And are you also saying, by arguing this, that Trump is not chaotic, there is a method to his madness?
Okay, if you look at the big picture, there is continuity. If you look at the trend, U.S. hegemony, U.S. power is in decline. The U.S. used to be the sole the sole unipolar power in this world, and this power is in decline. There are other powers that are now challenging this American status. So when Trump pulls his troops out of Syria, he is only, he's only endorsing this trend. He's actually proving to the world that the U.S. power is in decline. But when you look into details, there are certainly differences, at least in the style. Trump's style is very bold, very, you can call it chaotic, but I would rather call it frank. Trump does not have the same complex calculations that the American establishment has. The influence of the lobbies, the calculation of America's soft and hard power in world politics. Trump does not have any of that. So when he decides to pull out of Syria, he basically wants to get things done in a fast manner. And this, again, I would say, exposes America's hypocrisy in many of world affairs. They created many problems
interstate
in the Middle East and other places.
Interstate relations are all about double speak and, of course, interest. But thank you so much, Muslim bin Imran, for speaking with us. We now have Michael Arnold, who's a political analyst based in Istanbul, with us. Thank you, Michael. We're just discussing whether there is a pattern to Donald Trump's foreign policy, whether it's a continuation and perpetration and perpetuation of what is generally considered as the blob, which looks at the US grand strategy in relation to the rest of the world, or is it something completely chaotic, which changes from one morning to another?
In some ways, it could be in between the two. Look, I mean, I think clearly there is tension between if we want to call it Trump's foreign policy, as well as between Trump's foreign policy and particularly the political and security establishment in the United States. I mean, I think that's clear from the fact that immediate after he announced the withdrawal of troops from Syria, the Secretary of Defense, along with the special envoy to the coalition to defeat ISIS, resigned immediately. This is also reflected, for example, in conflict between the intelligence community and Trump that has existed from the very beginning. As to the question of whether Trump's foreign policy can be considered chaotic, I think that is probably stretching it a little bit, particularly because the security political establishment in the United States obviously retains a significant amount of power outside of the White House.
Okay, so make me understand if there is a pattern. Let's see. So the national security strategy document says that China and Russia are the US rivals. Then Trump indicates that in his nuclear posture review, he indicates getting new missiles for the submarines and also wants to get out of the INF. Of course, Putin has reacted to that. On the other hand, he meets with Putin and says, well, whatever my intelligence people are telling me about Russian involvement in the elections, that's all wrong, because President Putin has given me this absolutely clear denial that Russia was not involved. Then, of course, he wants to get out of the wars and yet moves the embassy to Jerusalem, gets out of Syria. Now, I would have understood all of this if I could find a pattern here. But what I see is that on the one hand, he says, I don't want to be in the wars because wars are destabilizing. Then he goes and starts doing things that are clearly going to destabilize.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've assessed it very well there. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any particular discernible pattern, and again, that may relate to this sort of internal conflict, if you will, in the United States between Trump and perhaps, or at least what appears publicly as his unpredictability, and the more stable political apparatus within the United States. I mean, it seems, I mean, obviously we don't know all the background, but it seems as though his decision to withdraw troops from Syria, how it's been narrated in terms of his phone conversation with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, caught his own advisors off guard who were on the phone with him. So,
Correct.
I mean, clearly there is this tension, or there appears to be this tension between this sort of what seems like an unpredictability of the current U.S. president and the political and security establishment. So I think you're very right to say that at this point, at least, it's very difficult to pick out a discernible pattern. Now, whether that's deliberate or not, of course, has been debated, but I don't think there's any real strong argument to say that this is being done deliberately by Trump as some sort of so-called madman strategy.
Well, tell me something about how you look at 2019. I mean, I usually don't put that question because I think, especially with someone like Trump, where every new morning is going to bring a new spate of tweets, which can throw everything awry. But nonetheless, I'll ask you this. How do you look at 2019, specifically with reference to the Great Middle East and also in relation to Afghanistan?
Sure. Well, I think, it seems as though the events in the greater Middle East will continue to unfold with perhaps less and less not only direct American involvement, but American influence. This is not to say that the Americans are not still the most significant foreign player in the Middle East, but clearly events, not only in this past year, but prior to that, prior to Donald Trump, have indicated that their influence and power is waning in the region. I mean, the latest decision to withdraw troops from Syria, this is another victory in some ways, if we can put it that way, for Russia in their effort that's been ongoing for at least the past decade to slowly push the United States out of the greater Middle East. So there's a number of issues here where American strategy, despite the rhetoric, is clearly lacking. Iran is another instance. It remains to be seen how effective the sanctions will be and whether or not that may stir up some political turmoil in Iran itself. But clearly within Syria, within the wider Middle East, the Americans have largely failed to contain Iranian influence.
Okay, so since you work on Syria and you've been following it for a very long time, tell us, and Bashar al-Assad clearly with help from Russia and Iran, and of course Hezbollah, is now fairly well entrenched. 2019, do you think that Bashar al-Assad will emerge as the overall sovereign of Syria, or do you see that 2019 will also have a lot of internal conflict in Syria?
Well, I think it's a yes and no. It's not a very satisfactory answer, but yes, with a caveat. So it's very clear that the Syrian regime has reestablished itself in much of the country. But there's a big caveat with that, of course, is that of course the Iranians, but particularly the Russians, essentially call the strategic direction in that relationship. So you could argue that although the Syrian regime has recovered some of its sovereignty, this is not like the sovereignty that it had before. It is dependent on a foreign state for that. There's a number of other factors too, especially. Turkish-backed forces still hold significant enough territory in northern Syria, and that may or may not expand depending on what Turkey and its Syrian allies decide to do in northeastern Syria after the American troops actually withdraw. So it may, on the surface, appear as though Bashar al-Assad's regime will regain sovereignty over Syria, but of course this is not going to solve a lot of the root issues. They will likely continue to to be problems. And I highly doubt that 2019 will see them regain control of all of the territory, which of course includes Idlib, which is currently under a Russian and Turkish memorandum of understanding, as well as the areas in northern Syria that are currently controlled by Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army forces, with the backing of the Syrian army, of course.
Okay. If we go back in history, we see that these states were essentially artificial. I mean, they begin with the French and the British mandates in the Middle East. And of course, then these borders became entrenched. But what we have seen post-Arab Spring, which didn't really lead to any spring, but nonetheless, the turmoil that we saw, the social unrest and the rest of it, do you think that at some point this will begin to rationalize and these states we might see realignment of borders or some such thing?
As much as you're correct in your analysis that these are essentially artificial states, I don't see that happening. And there are a number of reasons for that. One, despite the fact that these states were established, first of all, very quickly post-World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and despite the fact that they have, of course, been beset by conflict, the borders remain very hard. And I mean that both sort of in terms of politics, but also in terms of national identities. So despite, if you go to countries like Lebanon, if you go to Syria, where the borders are essentially artificial, and despite the internal conflicts that exist within these countries, there is a clear statement from people who live there that we are Lebanese, we are Syrian, we are Iraqis. So I don't really anticipate borders changing on that front. I don't think the wider international order has the appetite to see that kind of thing either. However, I think that particularly countries like Syria and Iraq will be characterized for the foreseeable future by internal conflict. So as much as the borders, I think, will remain completely intact, the internal constitutions of these states is definitely in question. Whether or not any kind of central authority can be reestablished, or is there going to be more fragmentation than there already is? These, I think, are distinct possibilities, but I don't foresee a realignment of borders, at least not anytime in the near future.
Okay, final quick question. Does that also include the Kurdish question?
Well, I think at this point the reality is that it does. You have Turkey, Iran, other players, Iraq as well, who are not interested in seeing a Kurdish state develop anywhere within their territory. So I think there's a lot going against those who wish to create an autonomous Kurdish state. But I think it's also very important to emphasize here that the discourse around the Kurdish issue has been very problematic, particularly in Western media, because for example, in northern Syria, the predominant force there, of course, is the YPG, which has its affiliations with the PKK here in Turkey, which, of course, not only Turkey, but the EU and the United States consider to be a terrorist organization. And the label to label these forces as being Kurdish, as opposed to one particular faction of Kurdish political thought and Kurdish political project, is problematic. So. I don't think the Kurdish question, as it's framed, will advance any farther in the next year or any time after that either.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael Arnold, for being with us and giving us a sense of Trump's foreign policy or the lack thereof. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we will continue with our discussion of President Trump's foreign policy. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We are continuing with our discussion of President Donald Trump's foreign policy or the lack thereof. And the analysts generally agree that it's kind of difficult to see a pattern in how Trump looks at the outside world. We are now joined by Van Megertachien, who's a French political analyst and journalist, based in Paris. Van, give us a sense of how you look at Trump's foreign policy, because apparently, there's lots of analyses say that this is chaotic. People say, well, he's doing or saying one thing and then goes and does something completely different. He is also in a Twitter mode all the time, taking very important decisions and putting out tweets without due consultation process. Is that your sense also?
Look, thanks a lot for having me, Ejaz. I don't know if chaotic is the right term for it. Look, let's take a few steps back and take the example of Syria. From what we know, what the decision of withdrawing about the 2,000 soldiers from Syria, U.S. soldiers from Syria, was taken after a few consultations with the Department of Defense regarding U.S. involvement in Syria. What we know of this is that the U.S. president had multiple conversations with U.S. State Department officials and the Department of Defense, where he asked the generals to give him a time frame when they could, in the next few months, when they could withdraw, when they could end their direct involvement in Syria with these 2,000 troops. According to these reports, the president was told every time that, give us some more time, give us some six more months, and then the president apparently got fed up with it and said, we're done, we're withdrawing now. This is according to the reports. Now, I don't know what to call these if they are not consultations. At the end of the day, the U.S. president is the commander-in-chief, so he would call the shots on these issues, just as he did this week. Now, compared to how he's approaching this foreign policy with regards to the rest of the world, I'm wondering whether this approach to foreign policy of restraining U.S. involvement around the world, restraining the American character of imposing, being unilateral, although the decision, some may call it unilateral as well by withdrawing, but there's so many people, so many analysts, so many officials in Europe, for example, for the past 20 years, have been worried about this big, huge American involvement overseas. They've been calling the Americans their direct opposites. And what Trump has been basically doing now through his policies is basically making the United States look more like Europe.
Fine. Trump has constantly been saying that he doesn't want to get involved in these foreign wars. And it's not just about Syria. He's also said that he's going to have the U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan. Now, there would have been a pattern if he had also, for instance, said that he wants to be a broker between Israel and Palestine. Whereas what we have seen is that he suddenly took a decision and moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. Similarly, with Iran, he got out of the JCPOA against the wishes of other agreement partners, the European Union and the United Nations.
There is this part where you have Afghanistan on one side, you have Syria. Well, Syria compared to Afghanistan and Iraq, it's a minor issue. Look, there are two different issues here. On the one side, you have a president who is basically paying promises, the promises he made to the American voters, the voters who basically elected him. And there is also the part where the president has, in one way or another, build up upon his predecessors' policies. In this case, Barack Obama's policies. Barack Obama's policies were basically on the U.S. involvement issue around the world has been pretty much very similar to what President Trump is doing today. On the Iran deal, what we're seeing is the U.S. president balancing up the American role in the Middle East by, reshaping the way the United States deals with Iran, and at the same time open up the space for perhaps other world actors to get engaged in the Middle East. Now, will that happen? We have to wait and see. But for so long.
But hold on. The Europeans cannot. The
Yes.
Europeans cannot really come in and engage, because it's not just about getting out of the JCPOA. For instance, if we take that example, it's also about the sanctions, which do not leave much space for the UK, France, and Germany to actually deal with Iran. I mean, they've been trying to do that, but they haven't really succeeded as yet. So it's not just about pulling others in and getting them to face up to their responsibilities. It is about restricting space for any meaningful engagement.
Yes, meaningful engagement on the part of the Europeans, perhaps. But at the same time, by withdrawing from Syria, by opening up for a better, you're basically seeing new actors involved.
Yeah, but
pay attention when every time there is a policy on the Middle East, the United States is dealing not with Europeans. Basically, they're only dealing with Turkey, and because the Americans think these are the two actors who can actually stand up to Iran and
But here,
primary adversaries.
But so the situation on the ground is that the Qatari question, the Iranians and the Turks are much closer and obviously on the same page compared to the rest of the Gulf states. So all of this, the flowchart becomes really complex and complicated.
The conflict with the rest of the world today for the past week has been centered on how to abandon your commitment to Syria, basically your commitment to protecting the Kurds, who have been helping us get rid of ISIS in Syria. Now, all of a sudden, everybody forgot that for the past year and a half, we have been asking the United States to commit to NATO, to commit to its alliances, to commit to its traditional allies in Europe. And people tend to forget that Turkey is one of those primary allies that make a big part of the NATO alliance. And if the United States is not going to commit to Turkey, then the United States is not really committing to NATO. Now that the United States is committing to NATO, the world is surprised that this is being dealt in this manner. But the Americans are also saying we are going to commit to our traditional Arab ally, which is Saudi Arabia. How will that turn out on the ground? We have to wait and see. We don't know. But Americans have accepted the notion today and reminded the world that they are committed to NATO. How would this affect their alliance with the Kurds in Syria? Well, unfortunately, Americans have to take sides. How they deal with this, come out of Syria without causing a lot of collateral damage, we have to wait and see.
Okay, Van, stay with. I'm also joined by Obada Hitto, who is a political analyst based in Istanbul. Obada, thank you for being on the program. We're trying to figure out what Donald Trump's foreign policy is, if at all. I mean, there are lots of people who say it's completely chaotic. There are others who say there's a method to this madness. Some say that he is wedded to some of the traditional determinants of foreign policy. Others say that there is a lot of tension between him and the traditional security establishment. What is your take on this?
If we want to understand Donald Trump's foreign policy, I think we're going to have to go back to the legacy that he inherited from President Obama. President Trump didn't really come into his presidency with many policy kind of agendas or different kinds of protocols that he was going to follow, other than that he wanted to pull out of the Middle East and other kinds of generic and general assumptions about how he was going to pursue his foreign policy. The decisions that he's been making, I think, have been mired by the investigations into his relationship and people around him, their relationships with Russia. And so I think that has made it difficult for Trump to actually put together, and his administration to put together, a coherent foreign policy. That being said, he has made some attempts to take very drastic measures in regards to the foreign policy. Now we can see that Trump is making more drastic decisions and kind of irrational decisions, if you will, based on the sentiments of his advisors and the military people who are around him. We saw that Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, resigned from his position soon after Trump's decision to announced decision to pull troops out of Syria. So obviously he's taking matters into his own hands and may not be actually taking the advice of his advisors or closest advisors, assumedly, such as his Secretary of Defense, into consideration. So it wouldn't help us much at this point to really try and evaluate what is possible now, but we can definitely see that he came into the presidency without a clear plan and continues to have any plan at all.
Okay, so if he doesn't have a plan, if he is playing from one morning to another, taking to Twitter and tweeting about this, that, and the other, then what exactly are we looking at? So he withdraws from Syria. Russia and Iran are already very strong presence in Syria. The national security strategy document says China and Russia are going to be the big rivals. Then he also meets with Putin and says essentially that my intelligence people fed me all the wrong information because Russia didn't do anything as far as the US elections were concerned. But on the other hand, he wants to get out of the INF, and the nuclear posture review says that he wants to get 2 new missiles for the submarines. So all of this doesn't really fit into some kind of pattern. I mean, these are not small pieces that one can build a large mosaic with, which actually makes some sense.
Exactly. This is kind of an erratic approach to his foreign policy. It almost seems like he has schizophrenia when it comes to his policy priorities and his policy decisions. The relationship with Russia is probably the most problematic because it seems through the investigations that are happening that there has been some sort of collusion with Russian officials. There have been communications with Russian officials who express their interest to influence American voters and to actually pay money to try and change the course of the elections. So the situation is very complicated for Trump, and his ability to get out of that situation is based on his business repertoire. He's a businessman in the end of the day. He is not approaching his politics in the way that a statesman would or a seasoned diplomat would. Instead, he's approaching it as a businessman. I think this is where much of his erratic behavior is manifesting from.
Okay. Van, do you agree with Obata Hitu that this is essentially the approach of a business person?
Look, it could be an approach of a business person. I would agree on that with the previous speaker. But I totally disagree on the issue that there is no plan at all. Look, again, I remind you, presidents come to power, presidents get elected based on an agenda. Presidents have certain agendas, they propose, they have campaign promises, they have their policy aims, their goals, but they don't have anything clear, and they don't have anything that would say we have to start from this and go to this point and the next. So presidents make their campaign promises, and then once they are elected to office, a lot of times they are shaped by the global events, some major events that could happen, that could affect their countries and their administrations. What President Trump, the American president, proposed, he proposed that Syria's neighbors, the neighbors in the Middle East, the big countries who have a lot of money, they have the capital necessary to help rebuild Syria. They have the capital necessary to ensure that there is peace in their vicinity. These countries need to play their role. He called for this during the campaign, and he's basically carrying it out by withdrawing from Syria and letting other neighbors of Syria take the helm and make sure that there is peace in Syria. Now, how will that plan out? We have to wait and see. We should judge that on the merits and on the results of the policy. On the issue of NATO, he did the same thing. He asked for traditional U.S. allies to pitch more money for their defense, and Europeans today have been trying to work harder and for the first time in decades say that they are they also are taking care of their militaries. They also want to modernize and someday perhaps make a more European level defense system that would help the Americans in NATO. So
okay,
there
Van, since you talked about NATO, Van, since you talked about NATO and you also said that you do not agree that there is no plan, tell me, NATO expansion has been a big thing with Moscow. Russia has been extremely unhappy with NATO expansion and also the Partnership for Peace program. Now, the National Security Strategy document looks at Russia as a threat. But on the other hand, if Donald Trump wants to improve relations, and if he wants to go in the opposite direction from the traditional security establishment, then you should probably be doing something about folding NATO back. But that is not happening. So where is the plan? What is the direction?
Well, the plan, first of all, would be not to haphazardly, on a full speed mode, expand NATO at this point. When you need Russia's assistance, when you need Russia's help in ending the war in Syria, then you better at least keep things on the confrontation between NATO and Russia where they are, and not make the situation worse. This would be a strategy the administration might follow, that we would keep things as they are. We would put a halt on new memberships to NATO. We would not encourage more countries to join NATO at this point. But at the same time, we would commit to what we had already committed in NATO to keep our defense budget and ask other countries to pitch in. This would be a way of trying to talk to Russia.
Okay. Thank you, Van Megerdatchian, for talking to us. Obaida Hitu, I have to wrap up the program. So, you really think there is a plan, as Van was saying? Because I can't see one.
Unfortunately, I don't think I agree completely with the other guest, with Van. The issue here is that Trump is being forced into a corner. As the guest mentioned, that he was brought to office by different kinds of interest groups and through funding and campaigning. And those people who put him in office have expectations. And now that he's in this corner, he is having to appease and appeal to different kinds of parties and different kinds of interests at the same time. And that's where these conflicting policies are coming in, and why he doesn't make sense when he says that, that in his national security strategy says that Russia is an enemy, but then it's found that Russia was actually helping him to get into office. So there's an inherent disconnect in the way that he came into office and in the American political establishment. And I think this is where the source of these incoherent policies are coming from.
Okay. Thank you so much, Obaida Hitu, for giving us your perspective on this. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.